In the previous session, we saw how God made a covenant with his people at Mount Sinai. We looked at the tabernacle, and we looked at the law that God gave to his people. After God made the covenant with his people, he called Moses to climb Mount Sinai. A man called Joshua went with him. There on the mountain, God gave Moses 2 stone tablets on which he himself had written 10 commandments. These commandments are recorded in Exodus chapter 20. God also gave Moses other laws and commands that he wanted Israel to obey. And he gave instructions about the tabernacle, the priests, and the sacrifices that were to be offered. Moses and Joshua stayed on the mountain for weeks. The Israelites began to wonder where Moses had got to. Moses was their leader, and God spoke to them through him. Perhaps the Israelites wondered if God had abandoned them. They should have trusted God and waited patiently for Moses to return. But they didn't. They bullied Aaron, the brother of Moses, into making an alternative god, an alternative that they could see with their own eyes. So Aaron made a golden calf. The people proclaimed, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." They seem to have been treating the calf as an image of false gods. This broke the first of the 10 commandments that God had given his people, which was this: "You shall have no other gods before me." But Aaron announced, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." The Hebrew word for Lord here is God's personal name, Yahweh. Aaron himself wanted the people to treat the calf as an image of Yahweh. This broke the second of the 10 commandments, which was this: "You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them." The people offered sacrifices to the idol, and ate and drank and had a party. In the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve rebelled against God. Now God's new mankind, Israel, rebelled against him. It was like Genesis chapter 3 all over again. Moses and Joshua came down from the mountain. They saw the people having a wild party. In his fury, Moses smashed the stone tablets on which God had written his law. Moses destroyed the golden calf. Men from the tribe of Levi killed around 3,000 idol worshippers, and the Lord himself sent a deadly plague among the people. God's people mourned. Moses pleaded with God to forgive them and to lead them into the promised land. God graciously renewed the covenant with his people. He wrote the law again on new stone tablets. Then the people constructed the tabernacle and made all its furniture and utensils. They set up the tabernacle and made everything ready. Then God moved into the tabernacle. A cloud covered it. This was a visible sign of God's presence, and the tabernacle was filled with the glory of God. God himself now lived among his people. God's people now broke camp and set off for Canaan, the promised land. God led them to the desert of Paran, about 150 miles northeast of Mount Sinai. Then Moses sent 12 men to the promised land to see what it was like. They returned bringing grapes, pomegranates, and figs. This demonstrated that the land was a paradise. But the spies also reported that there were powerful people in the land who lived in fortified cities. 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, trusted God. They were confident that he would enable his people to conquer the land. But the other 10 didn't trust God. Nor did the people. They cried, "Why is the Lord bringing us to this land, only for us to be killed by the Canaanites, and for our wives and children to be taken captive?" They said, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." They had completely forgotten how hard their lives in Egypt had been. God's people didn't trust him. God couldn't work with people who distrusted him. So he said that every Israelite eligible for military service, except for Caleb and Joshua, would die in the desert. These warriors, who should have spearheaded the conquest of a promised land, would now never enter it. But Caleb and Joshua did trust God. They did enter the land. For 38 years, God's people wandered about in the desert. Their base was an oasis called Kadesh Barnea, shown here in this picture. This map shows the location of Kadesh Barnea. It was very close to the promised land. But God's people remained in the desert until all the faithless warriors had died. During these years, a new generation of warriors came into being, a generation who did trust God and obey him, and who would conquer the land. But our patient, loving God remained faithful to his people. He cared for them in so many ways. He even made his presence visible to them during their travels as a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. At this point, we have to ask this question: could God's grumbling, faithless people ever conquer the promised land? But God had promised that this would happen, and God never breaks his promises. Eventually, God's people resumed their journey to Canaan. This map shows the approximate route they may well have taken. Then the king of Arad, a Canaanite king, attacked them and captured some Israelites. But God gave Israel victory, and they destroyed these Canaanites and their settlements. Israel travelled south and then northwards. They skirted the lands of Edom and Moab. This map shows the approximate route that the people seem to have taken. They defeated the Amorites and the people of Bashan and took possession of their lands. Finally, they camped in the plains of Moab, east of the river Jordan. The promised land was just across the river. The Moabites were terrified of God's people, so their king hired a pagan prophet called Balaam to curse them. But God allowed Balaam only to bless his people. In his final prophecy, Balaam said, "A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab." This astonishing prophecy looks forward many years to King David and his military victories. But it also looks beyond that to David's descendant, Jesus. King Jesus would defeat the supreme enemy of God's people, Satan. But we're shocked by what we read next. God's people committed sexual immorality and idolatry. Sadly, it was a foretaste of what they would one day do in the promised land itself. Before God's people crossed the Jordan into the promised land, Moses preached to them. His words are recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. This is an ancient manuscript of part of Deuteronomy chapter 8. It's over 2,000 years old. Moses renewed the covenant between God and Israel. He wrote down God's law for them. This may have been what is now most of the book of Deuteronomy. Joshua, one of the spies who trusted God, had by now been appointed to succeed Moses as Israel's leader. Moses commanded Joshua and the whole nation to be strong and courageous as they entered and conquered the promised land. God would never let them down. He would never abandon them. Moses sang a song to the nation, a song that God had given him. Then he blessed Israel. Finally, Moses climbed a nearby mountain and looked out over the promised land. Then he died. Joshua took over as Israel's leader. God's people crossed the river Jordan into the promised land. The river was in flood. This is an early photograph of the Jordan in flood. But God held back the waters. The people walked over the riverbed. It was like the Exodus from Egypt. This painting shows priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant across the Jordan. The people entered the promised land from the east, at the point shown on this map. God had sent Adam and Eve eastwards out of the Garden of Eden. God's people now entered the promised land the opposite way, from the east. It was as if they were returning to the garden. God's new mankind was entering a new Garden of Eden. For 40 years, God had been testing and disciplining his people in the desert. He wanted to know what was in their heart, whether they would wholeheartedly keep his commandments or not. He was teaching them to depend on him completely for all their needs and to obey him. God provided for his people during those years, just as parents provide for their children. Their clothes and shoes never wore out. God provided food and drink for them. This painting shows the people gathering manna, the food that God miraculously provided for them. God humbled his people, causing them to hunger, and then feeding them with manna to teach them that people do not live on bread alone, but on every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And God provided for his people even when they were disobedient, just as we provide for our children, even when they're disobedient. But once they reached the promised land, God began to treat his people as adults. He stopped providing manna. Now they had to plough the ground and grow their crops. If they obeyed God, they would prosper. If they were disobedient, they would suffer disaster. The promised land was at the crossroads of the world. It was a link between 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. The land was to be God's bridgehead into a world dominated by Satan. From this land, so strategically positioned, God was going to extend his kingdom across the whole earth. At that time, the Canaanites lived in the promised land. This photograph shows a gateway into an ancient Canaanite city. Moses had said to Israel that they were to destroy the Canaanites. They weren't to make any covenant with them or intermarry with them. They were to destroy their pagan shrines. Canaan was a stronghold of Satan. The Canaanites' idolatry and depravity is legendary. It included disgusting sexual practices and sacrificing children. This is the remains of a huge Canaanite sacrificial altar. God wanted his people to cleanse the land of such wickedness. God's people first attacked the city of Jericho, a few miles west of the river Jordan. For 7 days the priests carried the Ark of the Covenant around the city. This ark was kept in the most holy place in the tabernacle, the room where God lived. God himself was, so to speak, walking around Jericho. On the 7th day, the people shouted. Jericho's walls collapsed. God's people captured the city. At Jericho, Israel trusted and obeyed God, and God gave them victory. There was one Canaanite in Jericho who trusted God, a prostitute named Rahab. God showed mercy to her. She and her family were saved. Not only that, Rahab was an ancestor of Jesus himself. Next, the Israelites attacked a city called Ai, west of Jericho. But the attack failed. It failed because of one man's sin. When Jericho was being captured, this man, called Achan, had taken some precious things he'd found there and kept them, something that God had forbidden. That was a deliberate act of disobedience. It had devastating consequences. It caused the whole nation to be defeated. But when that sin was confessed and punished, God gave Israel victory over Ai. The conquest of Jericho and Ai gave Israel a base in the center of the promised land. From here they launched 2 campaigns, one to the south, the other to the north. This map shows how the promised land was eventually divided up among the 12 tribes of Israel. The tabernacle was set up at a place called Shiloh. This was around 10 miles north of Ai, in the center of the promised land. The main phase of the conquest was now over. We read this: "Not one of all the Lord's good promises to Israel failed. Every one was fulfilled." After Joshua's death, the tribes of Israel began to conquer the remaining Canaanites. But after a good start, things went wrong. God's people failed to complete the conquest of the land. They didn't drive out all the Canaanites. This hill is ancient Megiddo, one of the strongholds where Canaanites remained. A recurring cycle followed. Firstly, Israel worshipped the false gods of the other nations around them. So God allowed their enemies to oppress them. Because of this, God's people were in terrible distress. Then God gave them a deliverer called a judge. These judges included Samson, pictured here. Through these judges, God saved Israel from their enemies, and they enjoyed a period of peace. But when the judge died, the Israelites worshipped false gods again, and the whole dreadful cycle started all over again. This went on for up to 300 years or more. God was angry with his sinful people, so he refused to enable them to drive out the remaining Canaanites. The end of the book of Judges describes a scene of moral chaos. Israel should have kept the promised land, God's new Garden of Eden, holy. But they didn't. The land became the scene of vile depravity. But even in those dark days, God was working his purposes out. The little book of Ruth is set in the time of the Judges. It tells how a faithful Moabite woman called Ruth married an Israelite and became the ancestor of King David. David, in turn, would be an ancestor of Jesus. Then Samuel was born. He was the last of Israel's judges. He was also a prophet. God spoke to Israel through him. Samuel judged Israel faithfully for many years. But when he was old, the elders of Israel asked him to appoint a king to rule the nation. They wanted a king that was like the other nations' kings. Here's an ancient painting of an Egyptian king killing his enemies. Perhaps this was the kind of king the elders had in mind. But Israel wasn't supposed to be like the other nations. God himself was their king. God himself would give them victory in battle. But Israel wanted a man to rule them and to lead them in battle. So God gave them what they wanted. He gave them King Saul. Saul was tall and impressive. He began well, but he didn't obey God, so God had to reject him. Then God told Samuel to anoint another man to be king. His name was David. This is an artist's impression of Samuel anointing young David. Saul was jealous of David and even tried to kill him. But eventually Saul was killed in battle. David was proclaimed king, firstly by his own tribe Judah, then later by all Israel. David was different from Saul. Although David did fall into terrible sin at one time during his reign, David loved God. God gave victory to David wherever he went. David and his army completed the conquest of a promised land. David captured Jerusalem and made it his capital. This illustration shows what the city might have looked like in David's time. David brought the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. Here's an artist's impression of David dancing with joy as the ark is carried towards the city. As we saw in the last session, the ark was originally in the most holy place in the tabernacle. This room was God's earthly home. Now David wanted to build God another home on earth, a temple. So God sent the prophet Nathan to him. Through Nathan, God made a covenant, in other words, a binding agreement with David. 3 of the promises that God made to David were these. God promised to give Israel a secure and peaceful land. Wicked people wouldn't oppress them any more. God promised that David's dynasty, his family line of kings, would last forever. One of David's descendants would reign eternally. And David's son would succeed him as king of Israel. He would build God a house. In one way, these 3 promises were fulfilled through David and his son Solomon. David conquered all Israel's enemies. The nation began to enjoy peace and safety. David's dynasty lasted for centuries. For example, this is King Josiah, a descendant of David who reigned around 350 years after David did. And David's son Solomon built God a magnificent house, the temple in Jerusalem. But these 3 promises would be fulfilled in a much greater way too. They'd be fulfilled by another descendant of David, Jesus Christ. There would not only be a new land, but a whole new heaven and earth. God's people would live there, God's people living in God's paradise, in God's presence. Jesus Christ would reign over his people forever. And there would be a new temple. That temple consists of all true believers. God lives in them through his Holy Spirit. In Session 5, we learnt about the promises that God made to Abraham. God promised to give Abraham and his descendants a land. God promised Abraham a multitude of descendants. And God promised that through Abraham all the families of the earth would be blessed. God's covenant with David added to what God had promised Abraham. A key promise to David was about a king. One of David's descendants would reign forever. Through this king, all God's promises to Abraham would be fully fulfilled. That king was Jesus Christ. But time and again in the Old Testament, when things were going well for God's people, they sinned. David was relaxing in his palace. Looking out over the city, he saw a beautiful woman bathing. Her name was Bathsheba. He committed adultery with her, and he arranged for her husband to be killed in battle so he could marry her. God's prophet Nathan rebuked David, a scene depicted in this painting. David repented, and God forgave him. But God also brought judgment on David. Because of his sin, David and his family would suffer great trouble. But God still kept his promises to David. His son Solomon succeeded him around 970 BC. Israel entered a period of peace and prosperity unequaled before or since. In the next session, we'll trace the history of God's people from Solomon's reign to the time before Jesus was born.